All right, I've got noon, so we can go ahead and get started. All right, good afternoon, and thank you for joining us here at Champaign Public Library's webinar presenting Hidden Stories, the History of African Americans in Champaign County. Before I introduce our amazing presenters today, I would like to provide some information about the library and today's event. The Champaign Public Library main branch is open Monday through Thursday, 9 to 9, Friday and Saturday, 9 to 6, and Sundays, 12 to 6. The Douglas branch is open Monday through Thursday, 10 to 8, Fridays, 10 to 6, and Saturdays, 10 to 4. For more information about services, events, and access to much more, please visit champaign.org. Be sure to sign up for our e-newsletter from our website to know about events like this and other happenings and services at the library. Today's webinar will be conducted by Dr. Barbara Suggs-Mason and Angela M. Rivers. We will allow time at the end of the presentation for questions. You may use chat to type your question, or if you prefer to ask the question verbally, let us know and we can unmute you. Also, use chat if you are experiencing any technical difficulties and we'll try to help. Today's webinar will be recorded and featured on our YouTube channel under Champaign Public Library. Before Barbara and Angela begin, I would like to give a brief introduction of these two amazing women. Dr. Barbara Suggs-Mason has worked in the Illinois public education system for over 35 years. She is a recipient of an Award of Merit from the Illinois State Board of Education for her work as a classroom teacher. Barbara received the Bishop King Award from the Black History Committee of the Archdiocese of Chicago for her development of a Black history curriculum based on the 7 principles of Kwanzaa. Currently, she is a part of the New Leaders Mentor Program of Governors State University, where she mentors new school principals. A graduate of Champaign Central High School, she attended Northwestern University to pursue her musical studies and also received her master's and doctorate degrees here at the University of Illinois. Angela M. Rivers is an artist, educator, historian, and museum professional. She spent over 35 years in various positions in museums and in the cultural arts arena in Texas, Central Illinois, and the Chicago area, including educational director and assistant director of curatorial services at DuSable Museum of African American History in Chicago, and teaching African and African American art at Eastern Illinois University. A graduate of the Champaign school system, her family has been in Champaign County since after the Civil War. She is the granddaughter of Allen Albert Rivers Sr., noted as the first African American on the City of Champaign's police department. She was artist and project coordinator for the mural, The Pictorial History of African Americans in Champaign County, that formerly graced a building at Park and Fifth Streets. She holds a BFA from the University of Illinois. Please welcome Dr. Barbara Suggs-Mason and Angela M. Rivers.
Thank you very much. We are going to begin our program for you today. I'm very happy to be here. Okay, next one. Good afternoon. I want to talk about how we got here to the Champaign County African American Heritage Trail. Beginning in summer of 1978, I created, as I stated in my bio, and supervised the painting of the mural that was at the corner of the southeast corner of Park and Fifth Streets, which of course was entitled The Pictorial History of Champaign County, but also better known as the Park Street Mural. It depicted the story of African American experience from Africa to Champaign County, including ancient Egypt, life of Western Africa, the Middle Passage, slavery, early African American farmers in Champaign County, migration north via the railroad, religion, and community of the North End neighborhood. The mural became a focal point and a symbol of the neighborhood pride. In 2011, the mural and the building that was painted on was taken down to make room for a new structure. Fast forward to 2020. In the aftermath of George Floyd's murder and resulting protests, among community dialogue about the creating of several murals to address racial injustice here in Champaign-Urbana. Visit Champaign County, the city, and others were approached about facilitating a mural in downtown Champaign, celebrating the African-American history to promote unity and to provide education for generations to come. Specifically, my 1978 mural resonated with the City Council and community members, many remembering back to their childhoods. A small committee at the time determined that the series of murals centered around themes of innovation, business, social justice, education, music, and other things would be the best approach to solve the problem. In the searching for possible mural locations and where and whom to tap for resources on African-American history, an idea sparked to include the proposed murals in a county-wide heritage trail centered around historic buildings, locations, sites, parks, public art, churches, and museums, making it accessible for residents and visitors alike. The idea became the Champaign County African American Heritage Trail Project. Since the spring of this year, a large committee has come together to volunteer their time and efforts to map out this project under the leadership of my cousin, Barbara Suggs Mason, and myself. Our deep family history in the county, our passion, steadfast belief in education, history, and the arts guide our efforts. Okay. The committee is comprised of over 30 individuals that are from several different backgrounds, both civic, local, business, and educational. The committee is also divided into groups, or working groups, which include, excuse me, History and Archives, is chaired by Ray Cunningham of Homer Historical Society. It is responsible for the research and compilation of a historic timeline utilized to create and develop the other projects, the website, the trails, tours, and educational component. The second working group is Education. It's chaired by Barbara Suggs Mason. It's responsible for the development of educational tools, lesson plans, and materials, mainly for children K through 12, but also with activities and presentations for post-secondary students and adults. The third group is User Experience, chaired by Terry Riestek of the Visit Champaign County, sorry. It is responsible for media, including the website, branding, and marketing of the project. Then there is the Murals and Art, which is chaired by Kelly White of 40 North, 88 West, which is the Champaign County's Arts Council. This group is to identify the county's public art created by or with themes concerning African Americans to be included in the trail, the website, and additional tours. And finally, is the Financial Resource. It's chaired by Jane DeLuce of Visit Champaign County. It's responsible for securing funds, establishing funding mechanisms to ensure the project's stability.
So our mission was the first thing when the committee was called together by Jane DeLuce of Visit Champaign County. Our mission statement was one of the first things that we just knew that we needed to develop. So you see that before you. One of the two things that I want to bring to your attention that are extremely important. That the mission is to educate today's residents and visitors of the rich cultural history of a people whose stories have been largely unrecognized, but have directly shaped the place we call home. And we hope that our vision for the African American Heritage Trail as we develop it is to inspire conversation, to expand understanding, and to contribute to a better society, both our larger society and this place we call Champaign County.
The trail, or the Heritage Trail, is actually going to be composed of several parts or components. One is public art. The other one is murals, as we stated. Then there'll be trail markers that will help to define the trail and give you information along the way about important individuals, events, locations, and buildings. And finally is the website. The website will be an accumulation of all of those where you can go and find additional information, as well as being able to use the site to help you as you move through the trail.
So the education component is extremely important. Carter G. Woodson, who is the person who established the Black History Month, has said, "Those who have no record of what their forebears have accomplished lose the inspiration which comes from the teaching of biography and history." And so we feel that this is extremely important as we bring this rich history, this vibrant history of Champaign County and African Americans to our students in our K-12 buildings throughout the county. So we will be developing components, including a history in a box kits and field trips, as well as both virtual as well as in the field trips that our students K through 12 will be able to experience with units and instructional materials and professional development for our teachers. We started this work back in February of 2021, and we have been working on various elements within our working groups to develop our Heritage Trail, with our goal being that we are going to launch a bus tour to highlight the important places along the trail by June 2022.
Along with the trail itself, we're also working with two signature projects at this time that will correlate with the trail itself. The first one is the bus wrap for the Champaign Park District. The Park District has received a bus, which is going to be using for a lot of its activities within the park and the area. We will be also using the same bus as projects for our tours, local events with the area schools, and of course, also the bus will be used kind of like as a mini museum that will give you some information as you're traveling on it. The bus itself is going to be, the wrap itself is going to be about the history of Douglas Center and Douglas Park. The artist is Kean Daly, who is local, and hopefully we will see the unveilings fairly soon. The second project is Skelton Park. Skelton Park is located at the at First and Washington Street. Question is, why was this park chosen? It was chosen because it is located at the end of the first, what was considered the first street corridor, along, of course, along Washington Street, which was the heart of the African American business community as well, the community. Next, please. The group that we are working with the park is, of course, in conjunction with the Rotary Club here in Champaign. The park itself is going to be enhanced. It's to be used. The theme of the park is African American musicians and African American music of Champaign County. The park is for visitors, children, families to come and utilize. We're hoping to also establish probably an awards later on, which will be presented within the park itself. The overall plan of the park will include a sculpture, a Hall of Fame plaza, an area called the Fret Plaza, which will be attributed to blues, keyboard plaza attributed to jazz, a pavilion for use for important events, musical events, families, etc. Musical sculptures that will be designed for children to play on, as well as a walking path and a general path. Okay.
So funding opportunities. This committee is being led by Jane DeLuce, who's the Executive Director of Visit Champaign County and who brought us all together as a committee. And so we are looking at funding opportunities that include the Illinois Tourism Attraction Program Grant, Urbana Arts and Cultural Grant, the Community Foundation of East Central Illinois, private foundations, other government partners, and corporate and individual donors. One of the things that we are also doing, and you're about to see our website, is that we also take individual donations on our website to help to finance this project. So we're going to move from here to the website. Because we want to share with you, let me just.
We would like to share with you some of the sites that we have found that I think would be very interesting, that will be included within the tour and the trail itself.
Barbara, while you're getting that ready, I do have a question. Well, if you want to address it as part of the education component, will speakers and presenters be going into the classroom as part of that project for the education component of the trail?
We are going to try to create a list of speakers who are available to do so, yes.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so the African American Heritage Trail website has been designed to highlight places throughout the county where African Americans have lived and worked. Historically, in Champaign County, we've always had a vibrant Black community of people who've lived lives of dignity and grace despite the barriers of segregation, racial prejudice, the Klan, and a lack of opportunities that they encountered often on a daily basis. But in many cases, these men and women who were ordinary people but led extraordinary lives were able to thrive and contribute to Champaign County. And so briefly, we're going to start with Angela, and she is going to look at Homer, Illinois, and some of the individuals there.
The Homer Broadlands area was the first area for African Americans to settle within the county dating back to 1850. It was the first African Americans came as farmers, farmhands, servants, and cowboys working on large stock ranches found around and below Broadlands itself. During the Civil War, there was a lot of Africans began to move in as skilled laborers and tradesmen in order to start a new life. First person we're going to look at is Wiley and Frances Jones. Wiley came to Homer from Decatur, Georgia after the Civil War with William C. Custard, who was a soldier from the area. Jones he was a boy at the time that he came. He was able to go to Homer High School, Homer School, in order to get his education. And he would go on to run a barbershop for years in the Homer area and was a trustee of the Homer Savings and Loan Association. In 1877, Wiley married Miss Fanny Robinson Morgan at the home of Reverend Whitlock. Fanny would go on and they lived a prosperous life, with Fanny dying in 1914, and Wiley Jones died in 1919 after a fatal fire that was caused when he was lighting his stove. Next is Broadlands area. Broadlands was mainly farmland, and one of the more prominent families in the area was the Smith family. George W. Smith arrived in Champaign County in 1876 and purchased his first 80 acres. Formerly enslaved, during the Civil War, he acted as a Union scout in Tennessee. A noted stockman and farmer and horseman, at the time of his death in 1911, he owned 437 acres and was worth, in today's money, $3,717,800. His sons, William Walker Smith, became the first African American to graduate from the University of Illinois in 1900. George's other sons expanded and continued the farm. In 1983, the Smiths were awarded a Centennial Farm designation for being a family, for the farm being in the family for 100 years. As of 2012, the last 160 acres were still under family ownership. The next family is the Gaines family, also of Broadlands. Anthony Albert Gaines, also known as Albert Anthony Gaines, arrived in Champaign County with his stepfather, George Smith, in 1876. He continued to assist with the Smith's farm. And then in 1893, he married Dora Earnest Thompson, the daughter of Jacob Earnest, who was another African prominent African-American farmer in the area. Doris and Anthony established a farm approximately 2.5 miles north of the Smith's family in the Raymond County town, in the then Raymond County Township, and it became one of the major Black farmers in the county. His daughter Helen and her husband Jesse C. Ward eventually took over the farm. In 1999, the farm was still in the family's hands with Gaines's grandson Ernest Ward living there and renting out the last acreages for farming. By the late 1850s, African Americans began moving into the Twin Cities. They created businesses, established churches, fraternities, social events that they shared with the outlying county. This would begin the Black community. One of the early visitors of note that was African American to Champaign County was Frederick Douglass. On February 15, 1869, at Barrett Hall, located on the second floor above what was Henry Swanell's drugstore, now One Main Plaza in Champaign. His topic was a self-made man. According to the News Gazette, dated February 17, 1865, his wit was keen and sparkling, his humor dry and effective, and his logic and arguments as clear as that of most polished orators in the land.
So Black churches in Champaign-Urbana were an integral part of the fabric of the culture of African Americans. There are three that we are highlighting with our African American Trail. The first is Bethel African Methodist Episcopal Church, which is located at 405 East Park Street. This is the oldest African American led church in Champaign County, and the AME Church nationally is the oldest predominantly African denomination in the country. The church was organized in 1863, and this predates the establishment of the University of Illinois. During the early part of the century, when segregation was a fact of life, Bethel established a library, a church orchestra, and served as a meeting place for Black students attending the University of Illinois. On Sundays, they could get a good hot meal. Albert Lee, who was a member of the church and worked at the university, helped many of them to find housing where they could live. And they had literary society and study places at the church. The church has continued to be an important part of the African American community. In 1915, it hosted the first meetings of the NAACP in Champaign County, and it was an integral part of many of the social movements in the county, as we will talk about a little bit later in this presentation. The second church of significance in the history of Champaign County is Salem Baptist Church, which is at 500 East Park Street. Now, it's 1 block away from Bethel AME Church, and so I recall as a child there was a lot of interaction going back and forth within that block on a Sunday. It was established in 1867, the same year that the University of Illinois was established, and it was called Second Baptist Church originally because it was there was already a First Baptist Church in Champaign that was all white, and so it had the name Second Baptist. The original church was destroyed by a fire. It was an arson, proven to be arson. And after occupying several locations temporarily, including the Swanell drugstore above at Barrett Hall and a location on East Clark Street, the church bought land at its current location in 1901. The church was established. One of the most significant people to establish a church was a gentleman named David Johnson, who had been enslaved before the Civil War, who managed to escape and served in the Union Army, and then moved to the Champaign area, and he was one of the founders of the church. As with Bethel AME Church, Salem Baptist Church has a rich cultural history as well as a spiritual history, and members of that church have had important positions within the community as we've moved forward in business as well as social activism. And the third church that the trail looks at is St. Luke Christian Methodist Episcopal Church, which is located at 809 North 5th Street. Originally established as St. Luke Tabernacle on Eads Street in Urbana. It went by the name of the Colored Methodist Episcopal Church, and that was changed by the denomination to in 1954 to Christian Methodist Episcopal, and the church in its current location was moved there in 1914, and that is St. Luke CME Church.
Next, we'll talk about the first street corridor, Champaign. North 1st Street is one of the oldest districts in Champaign, which was established in the 1850s at the time that they decided that the Illinois Central was going to come through what was then known as East Urbana. Since its earliest years, African Americans have lived, worked, and owned businesses there, including the Mystic Theater, which was the first and only African-American movie house and vaudeville theater in the 1910s in Champaign and Urbana. Over the years, as the population grew, on and around First Street, over the years, as the African-American population grew on and around First Street, it became almost exclusively African-American, and it became its business hub, or what we consider as the Black downtown.
Now we're going to move to Douglas Park and Douglas Center, which may be familiar to many of you. It is on East Grove Street in Champaign, and the park and center are named after Frederick Douglass. In 1941, the Douglas Community Service Committee began an effort to raise funds for a new complex to be built on 2 empty lots. This was precipitated because during World War II, at the Chanute Air Force Base, African-American soldiers were not allowed to use the USO, and they then had were allowed to use 2 rooms in the basement of the old Lawhead School for their activities. And a lot of the activities also attracted a lot of community members who were looking for the opportunity to have a much larger arena for recreation. So ground was broken in 1944 and the center was completed in 1946. And although this is a black and white picture of the original building, what I remember from my childhood was that it was painted lime green. So I don't know if that's what it was originally painted, but when I was growing up here, that's the color I remember. The center held classes in art, music, sewing, and among other activities, as well as athletics of softball, baseball, basketball, track, and tennis. And as I recall, they also had boxing there. The center hosted many social events. Performers would come through, bands would perform there. And one of the most important groups there was a group that received national recognition was the Drum and Bugle Corps and Drill Team, who I remember in the 4th of July parade every year. That was a big event that we all waited to see them march, and they won some national awards. In 1975, 200 local residents protested the decision by the park board to demolish the old Douglas Center and replace it with a new gym. The group advocated that instead of just putting up a gym, they wanted it replaced with a full-service comprehensive center. There was a lot of discussion, some protests and meetings between the community and the park board, and the old center was eventually torn down and the new center was constructed. It opened on December the 12th, 1976. In March of 1978, the Douglas Annex was opened with a focus on serving the senior citizens of the community. And in 1997, the Douglas Branch Library moved into its current location. Along that area around Grove and 5th Street, we also centered the education of many African-American children. Although I think it wasn't called Unit 4 then, it might have been called Unit 71, but the school system in Champaign at that time, attendance was by neighborhoods. And as the area that is now called the North End changed, in the early years, it served German and Italian immigrants from the neighborhood. And as African Americans moved in the area, Lawhead School, which you see as the top photo, was integrated for a period of time. But by the 1940s, it was attended by 100% African American students, and the white students who lived still in the area were sent to Columbia School. So I talked about the Serviceman's Club that was organized in the basement of Lawhead School. And eventually, as you can see, the buildings needed to be, the quality of education and facility needed to be upgraded. And so in 1952, Lawhead School was closed and Booker T. Washington School, which you see an architect's drawing below, that the old school was opened up. In terms of educators, May Hawkins was hired in Champaign Public Schools in August of 1934 as the first African-American teacher hired in either Champaign or Urbana. According to the News Gazette at the time, Ms. Hawkins was hired to teach the, quote, colored students, unquote, exclusively at Lawhead School. She was well educated at Illinois State Normal University and attended the National Kindergarten School in Evanston. In Urbana, Taylor Thomas was hired as the first African-American teacher, and he was hired in 1956 to teach at both the junior high and the high school. I believe he taught history, and he would eventually, a lifetime Champaign resident, he would eventually move up to the position of assistant superintendent in the Urbana schools. As we talked about, the Booker T. Washington Elementary School was designed by Berger Kelly. It was as a K-6 building serving the Black students in the neighborhood, with Odelia Wesley becoming at first a grade school teacher at Lawhead and then eventually the principal of an all-Black staff. She served until 1972, and At 1968, when the Champaign schools integrated, a Booker T. Washington School was established as a magnet program in partnership with the University of Illinois. As part of the desegregation plan, they wanted to make voluntary integration for white families and students on the southwest side of Champaign. And so they created programs that would attract them to voluntarily send their children to Booker T. Washington, while Black families would be bused, and their children were bused to Southwest Champaign to integrate schools there. Following Mrs. Wesley, Mrs. Hester Suggs assumed the principalship for another 20 years and developed an award-winning arts and humanities-based program that continued under the leadership of Arnetta Rogers. In Urbana, the schools were integrated and in, I believe, 1967, and a great deal has been written recently about the Ellis Six, which were several Black families who lived on Ellis Drive in the Urbana Ellis subdivision and who protested for the integration of Urbana schools.
Carver Park, or Carver Park subdivision. During the end of 1940s, at a time when the North End was becoming increasingly populated and squeezed in, there was decisions were being made as far as determining, as far as developing low-income housing in the area as well as outside the area. Along with development of the low-income housing, there was the African-American middle class was essentially overlooked. So in 1951, an African-American civic leader, Charles Phillips, saw the need for the quality single-family housing in the Black community. So, excuse me, he put together a grassroots coalition of friends and acquaintances and bought 10 acres of farmland just above Bradley Avenue and hired the developer Ozier Weller, homes to build them. Each family put up $350 to develop the 70-home subdivision, which was named after the African-American scientist and inventor, George Washington Carver. It was Champaign-Urbana's first subdivision that was financed and built by African Americans. Finally, we talk about Rantoul and the former Chanute Air Force Base and the 99th Pursuit Squadron. On March 22nd, 1941, the first all-Black fighter squadron, known as the 99th Pursuit Squadron, was activated at Chanute Field. Pursuit was the pre-World War II term for fighter. At the time, the U.S. Armed Forces maintained segregated units. Over 250 enlisted men were trained at Chanute Field in aircraft ground support, aircraft maintenance, supply clerks, weather forecasters, armourners, as well as preliminary instructions as fighter pilots. When the men of the 99th left Chanute to go to Tuskegee in November of 1941, they left behind the highest collective grade point average ever earned at the base before or since their stay. These men would become the core of the squadron, squadrons that formed at Tuskegee and Maxwell Fields in Alabama. Let's move it up, please. Where the fighter pilots being trained would be later known as the Tuskegee Airmen. Brigadier General Charles McGee, who just died recently at the age of 102, was part of that group that enlisted at Chanute and became part of the Tuskegee Airmen, flying with the 302 Fighter Squadron. He was a student at the University of Illinois and married a hometown girl, Frances Nelson, who was the daughter of Joseph Nelson, in 1942. Charles flew his first mission in Italy on Valentine's Day in 1944 and would go on to fly 409 combat missions through World War II, Korea, and Vietnam. It was one of the highest total missions of any American Air Force fighter pilot.
So thank you. We're going to now look at some more hidden stories, and we're going to share two with you this afternoon that we felt indicate the essence of what Carter G. Woodson said history should be, and that is that we celebrate the countless Black men and women who have contributed to the advancement of the human civilization.
The 370th Infantry Regiment was formed out of the 8th Infantry of the Illinois National Guard, which was an all-Black unit. The 8th Infantry had a history that dated back to the 1870s when it was established as a militia in Chicago, Illinois. By the World War I, they had been incorporated into the National Guard. Their headquarters was in Chicago, and they recruited from Springfield, Danville, Metropolis, Peoria, as well as Chicago. As stated before, it was a segregated unit, and but it was also the only all-Black unit with all Black officers, staff, medical corps, as well as enlisted men. The 357th trained and fought with the French army because the American military did not want them to fight with the white soldiers. So the French needing soldiers was very willing to take them as well as other all-Black regiments to fight alongside their men. Here we see, okay,
I'll go back.
Okay, here we see the soldiers, some of the soldiers of the 370th in their French uniforms. As you can see, they have like the helmet, the uniforms. Okay, can go to the next.
So the 370th Infantry trained at Camp Grant in Rockford and Camp Logan in Houston, and sailed to France April the 7th, 1919. As previously stated, their training, equipment, and uniforms were all issued by the French Army. And the French Army and the colonial African troops who fought with them called them the Partridges because of their proud bearing. And the German soldiers called them the Black Devils because of their fierce fighting ability. They returned from France, arriving in the US on February 15th, 1919, and paraded proudly down Michigan Avenue in Chicago. The 370th suffered a 20% casualty rate, and 71 of their soldiers received the French Croix de Guerre. So we're mentioning them because there were several local men who served in the 370th. William Frank Earnest, Cecil Dewey Nelson, Dr. Harry D. Ellis, who fought as a private and returned to Champaign as the second Black physician in the community, Dr. Lawrence DeFay, who also served as a private and returned as a practice as a podiatrist. And although he was from Springfield, Colonel Otis B. Duncan was the highest ranking Black officer to fight in the war and also has some roots here in Champaign County.
William Frank Earnest. He was the son of William Frank Earnest, became a sergeant with the 357th, and then went to France. He was a son of William Frank Earnest and Hester C. Earnest of Chuckey, Tennessee. He was 8 years old when this family moved to Homer, Illinois. A graduate of the Homer High School of the class 1915, where he edited the yearbook. He also played in numerous plays. He also acted in numerous plays while he attended the school. In 1916, he decided that he was going to attend the University of Illinois. So the family moved to Champaign to make it easier for him to attend. He would join Bethel AME Church. He became a student athlete for the university. He joined the Kappa Alpha Psi fraternity, and he majored in agriculture. William Frank was one of a series of children of Oliver Earnest, who was born in 1859 through 1936, and Hester Earnest, who was born 1855 through 1939. His other siblings that accompanied them to Homer was Francis Earnest and Robert Earnest. The parents were both formerly enslaved in Greene County, Tennessee, where Chuckey was located. On September 17th, 1918, William Frank made a supreme sacrifice. He was killed on the battlefields in France.
This is a description of his death that was made by Captain Braden, who was the chaplain and in the unit, and also the pastor of Berean Baptist Church in Chicago, which is a pretty predominant church there. And he describes his death as his body, poor, bleeding, torn, and mutilated, was buried in no man's land by his comrades. Why was he forgotten when the Distinguished Service Crosses were awarded? Ask Colonel T.A. Roberts, he knows. And that is an alludes to the fact that there was some racial tension within the unit because Several of the Black officers were replaced by white officers who unit members felt were not sympathetic to the Black men under their service. The next person that we're going to talk about is Cecil Dewey Nelson. He was the son of Joseph Franklin Nelson and Stella Bell Nelson. And you'll see a picture of them in front of their home in Urbana, Illinois, with their other three children. He attended Champaign High School, and he met William Frank Earnest through the 370th, and they became very good friends. And the story is important because of the fact that this friendship led to, although Cecil Nelson didn't know him before he joined the military, he met him afterwards. Sergeant Cecil Dewey Nelson was awarded on October the 18th, 1918, he was awarded the French Croix de Guerre for bravery in battle by General Vincent Daun, commander of the 59th French Division. Now, the reason that I believe the 370th is important is because how many of you have heard of the Harlem Hellfighters? That's the 369th, which was also an all-Black unit based out of New York. Well, very recently, the Congress issued them a Congressional Medal for their service during World War I. And I've often wondered why I always hear about the Harlem Hellfighters, but I rarely hear about the 370th, who were based in Chicago and basically were populated by men from Illinois. So I think it's important that they also receive the recognition because their records are very similar. The citation for Cecil Nelson was for extraordinary bravery, wounded at his post. Notwithstanding his wounds, he continued to follow his company under the violent artillery and machine gun fire and did not hesitate to crawl to an exposed and dangerous position in order to bring aid to a severely wounded comrade. And for this, he was awarded the French Croix de Guerre.
The medals that you see before you are the French Croix de Guerre, are the ones that was awarded to Cecil Nelson. To your left, you see the French Croix de Guerre. On his cap from the American Legion, you see his Purple Heart, his Silver Cross, as well as other small awards from both his service and during his activity during being a Legionnaire. Afterwards, Cecil Nelson would return to Champaign, Illinois. On getting back to Champaign, he went to see the Earnest household to return some of the personal items from his friend William Frank. There he met Carrie Earnest, who was William Frank's niece. The two would marry and raise 6 children here in Champaign. The children were Cecil, Ernest, Eleanor, Estella, Hester, and Eunice. Black vets from World War II, upon returning, decided to establish the William F. Earnest American Legion Post 559, which was incorporated in 1932. Also, the University of Illinois would honor William Frank Earnest by placing his name on one of the columns of the Memorial Stadium, completed in 1923, to honor the student athletes who had gave their lives during the war.
We're running short on time, but this last section I think is extremely important because this is an opportunity in the the life of the African Americans in this community when they came together as a collaborative to protest unfair employment practices that they were experiencing in 1961 and before. J.C. Penney's department store had a store in Urbana, but they built a brand new one at 15 East Main Street that was scheduled to be opened on April the 6th, 1991. And ministers in the African American community had recently organized as the North End Ministers Association and encouraged members of their congregation to apply for the nearly 150 jobs as sales positions that were advertised. And several Black women had applied for these positions as sales clerks, including the wife of a Chanute Air Force Base employee who had 10 years of experience in the previous city that they lived in Denver. All were denied employment. The result was an organized collective action on the part of the Black community. And this protest was organized under the leadership of Reverend J.E. Graves of Mount Olive Missionary Baptist Church. Over 100 members of the community attended a rally at Bethel AME Church to express their anger and the call to action. Ministers took the leadership because their positions were less vulnerable than their congregations in terms of retribution, and they feared retribution if they protested. So as I said, all of the churches except for one, and they don't name which church that was, and many, many men and women in the African American community came together to organize and protest. That included Reverend Graves, Reverend Williams of Salem, and Reverend Curry of Bethel, who provided leadership. Reverend Graves called a meeting of ministers and lay people on Wednesday, March the 22nd to map out a plan for action, and the Champaign-Urbana Improvement Association was founded to demand for greater job opportunities for African Americans in the community. Mary Alexander, who was a member of Salem Church and one of the association's co-founders, took the lead in scheduling the pickets so that the line was always covered. And George Pope, who was a member of Bethel, was designated as the picket captain to train volunteers in picketing discipline. The community saw this as a magnificent undertaking. As plans became known in the community, enthusiasm began to build. Picketing began on the opening day of the J.C. Penney store, April the 6th, 1991. And while the pickets were largely African American at the beginning, they were soon joined by white citizens, particularly university students and professors who sympathized with the efforts of the Black community. And the picketing continued for 3 weeks. Meanwhile, the Champaign-Urbana Improvement Association began training potential job applicants in interview techniques. And it's interesting that I met someone, actually I had known her growing up, Carol Lewis, who was Mary Alexander's daughter, who was one of the trainers for this. I actually met her this week, and she talked about how they organized the training for interview techniques for potential candidates. So by April the 25th, with the assistance of City Councilman Kenneth Stratton, an agreement was reached that impacted all department stores. All department stores in the downtown area, as well as Goldblatt's, signed the agreement. And in fact, Goldblatt's actually was before J.C. Penney's and getting sales clerks hired. And this was a very inspirational victory for the Black community, who felt empowered to begin to organize for a number of civil rights pieces that were necessary in the community moving forward. And as one will see in the 60s and 70s and 80s. So that concludes. We are just a couple of minutes after 1, but if there are questions, we would like to entertain those at this time.
Thank you, Barbara and Angela, and thank you so much for sharing that last story. you had shared that with both Madeline and I earlier this week, and I'm really glad that you had an opportunity to share that because it was very impactful to me when I heard it. So thank you. We do have a couple of questions that came through during the presentation. So if you guys don't mind, we'll run through them kind of quick.
Sure, absolutely.
All right. We had one that had a question about the cost of Skelton Park renovation, and wondering if you knew what the expected cost might be for that.
I don't have a good answer for that. I think that's a question. I know it's in partnership with the Champaign Rotary, the Champaign Park District, and Visit Champaign County.
It also is partnership with the basic park itself and renovations of the boneyard. So it's also the city that is also in partnership with them as far as the overall
cost
project, right? So
Okay.
at this point, I really could not give you a set dollar amount because it's will be part of the overall improvement of the boneyard.
Sure. Thank you. What from Ashley, I'm just going to read what she wrote in, was our 4th grade curriculum in Champaign schools focuses on the Great Migration. I wonder if there may be any information regarding Champaign specific impact from this time in history. If not, that would be of great interest as a teacher.
Right. We do have some facts and figures. Unfortunately, we have 1 hour to present, and there's lots of history. We have over 170 years of history. So we have actually tracked through the U.S. Census the population of African Americans in Champaign County from 2 individuals in 1850 to over 28,000 in currently in the last census. And what we're tracking is where we see those significant increases in population, looking at the families that traveled here and what brought them here to Champaign County. So the Great Migration is an important piece, and but there are different eras of that depending on the war, the Depression, or things that were going on in the South. For instance, my father's family migrated from Monticello, Georgia in 1921. And as I investigated that, and his family, as well as about 5 or 6 other families who settled here in Champaign-Urbana, I looked at the number of lynchings that were going on in Monticello, Georgia, and Georgia at that time. Some of them that made headline news in the New York Times. So it was a period of stress there that I do believe made my great-grandfather, motivated him to take his son and his nephew and come to settle in Champaign-Urbana, and then send for his widowed sister and his wife and family to come here. So there are many reasons for that. I think that we are beginning to look at documentation among the families who did make that transition as to why they selected Champaign as opposed to going to Chicago or some of the larger cities.
Excellent. Thank you, Barbara. There was one more, not so much a question, but just a statement that from Abby, I believe it was from. While writing a paper for DEI course at UIUC, I found a term paper that referenced the Douglas Center many times, and Mrs. Irma Bridgewater. It discussed how UIUC had Louis Armstrong, Duke Ellington, and other amazing artists perform, but they had to change clothes at the Douglas Center because UIUC didn't allow them to use the dressing rooms. She just wondered if these stories will be shared in any capacity or if you were aware of those.
Yes, in fact, both Angela and I were involved with the University of Illinois when they had their 150th celebration in the creation of a video and a discussion about the impact of African-American students at the university who were not allowed to live on campus. And so in fact, it's documented that Albert Lee, who was a citizen in Champaign-Urbana, helped them to find places to live in the greater Black community. So those things will also be discussed. I did mention that in fact, Douglas Center was the site of some performances by some of those bands that you mentioned also. Yeah, we're not trying to erase the discrimination, but we also want to celebrate the fact that there were major accomplishments made by many community members. And in fact, many of their children who were educated at the university were not able to find jobs in their chosen field and had to leave this community to go to larger urban centers where they could establish themselves. And we have a rich history of that. And I believe that there's a recent book out of the 4 Nesbitt brothers who came out of St. Luke's CME, who were all educated at the University of Illinois and moved to Chicago and had very prominent careers. There are many others that I could name, but we're not going to ignore the discrimination that they experience, but we also want to tell the tale of persistence and overcoming a lot of this to be successful in their own right.
Thank you. That is all the questions that we had come through, and since it is getting a little bit over time, I just want to wrap up by saying a special thank you to Angela and Barbara for sharing these stories of African Americans in Champaign County. I noticed we had several people just posting in the chat that they had no idea that some of these rural communities that exist now had African Americans living there. And so I think this just speaks to the importance of telling these stories and the work that you're doing. If you'd like to learn, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Okay. Concerning the rural communities, the majority of the towns, the rural communities in Champaign did have at least 1 or 2 African Americans, if not families and communities that lived there, at least through the end of the 1800s and the beginning of the early 1900s, moving from the areas because of jobs.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but the planned and goal for the bus tour in June, that's hopeful, in 2022, will visit some of these, will it visit those communities as well, or would that be focused on the immediate Champaign-Urbana area?
Well, the first trail that we are going to do and tour will probably be focusing on the Homer Broadlands area. But also there's area that's around Sydney. There were some African Americans that lived in Mahomet, or what is now Mahomet, Tolono, and up in the north eastern section of the county as well. But that will be for later on.
Sure, sure.
And I do want to say that, and I know you're closing out, that there's just not enough time to tell the full story, but we wanted to highlight some of the things. There's so many families, family names as we do our research of people that really need to be recognized for what they have contributed to the community. And it is our hope as we move forward and we expand the website that we'll be able to include as many of those individuals as possible.
Yeah. And mentioning your website, you know, if you want to learn more about the Champaign County African American Heritage Trail or submit images, perhaps you have images that would be for consideration, please visit ccafricanamericanheritage.org, and all the wonderful pictures and stories you saw today are housed there as well. Thank you so much again for joining us, and we hope to see you here at the library. Visit us online at champaign.org to check out more great events and that we have here at the Champaign Public Library. And without further ado, go enjoy the rest of your afternoon. And thank you again, Angela and Barbara and Madeline on the sidelines.
Thank you.
Thank you.